Right, one of the youngsters. Right. I'm Paul Hobday, and thank you very much for the invite. I'm full of admiration for these dedicated warriors from KOSHH. The time and effort at great personal cost they invest fighting for your healthcare is, in the words of Alan Hansen, truly awesome. As you've heard this evening, their message is simple, truthful, and purely altruistic, in stark contrast to the duplicitous liars that work at the Epsom St Helier Trust and their devious self-serving political masters. As you may gather, I'm not going to mince my words. That may sound very harsh, but Sandra has already proved the point with that. But what is happening here is being replicated across England. This is a nationwide assault on our NHS, although the Scottish, the Welsh and the Irish are not so compliant. Of course, local campaigns concentrate on the immediate and obvious threat, which is the downgrading or closure of departments or even hospitals, and that's not surprising. But what few are aware of is that this scandalous and clandestine plot against our NHS, which is, believe it or not, aiming to replace it with an American-style profit-driven service making a few people extremely rich, this also depends on dismantling general practice. So I'd like to go off on a slight tangent from what we've heard tonight and tell you about what is planned for your GP. Sure. These so-called reforms started well over a decade ago, with GP services being sliced up and reduced, defunded, restrictions on what your GP can do, and a deliberately planned staffing crisis. You heard a couple of weeks ago in the media how GP numbers have fallen again, the first sustained drop for 50 years, lower than pretty well every other civilised country. With all that, it's actually quite a tribute to dedicated NH staff that at the moment, the only real practical problem for most patients with their doctor is difficulty getting an appointment. But sadly, this sets patients and doctors against each other when actually we are on the same side. Those responsible, the politicians who have planned it that way, get away scot-free, and they fuel the blame game as a decoy via their friends in the media. But I'm afraid all this is going to get a lot worse. Last week, GPs were manipulated into accepting a new contract, which is a giant leap towards your local traditional family doctor becoming a distant memory. More about that later. When you consider that on average people see their GP over 5 times each year, that's for most that's many more visits than you're going to hopefully pay to your local hospital. You will begin to see how very personal this is going to become. It will affect every single person in the country, except perhaps the very wealthy. I was a GP in Kent for over 30 years, and I'm keen to tell you what my job was like at first, what it became, and how it will soon become, and by implication, of course, how that will affect you and your family. When I started in the 1980s, I went into a world where all GPs were responsible for their patients on their list 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And that had been the case since 1948. I was the first port of call, and the buck stopped with me. If anybody needed a doctor, whether at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday or 9 p.m. on a Saturday night, they called me, and one of my partners usually visited the patient at home. I was 100% my patient's advocate, fighting for their correct care. There were no external pressures or internal pressures on me to be anything but. It defined the job. It was an era of cooperation. It was Bevan's NHS run on his founding principles. If I couldn't solve a problem, I was free to refer on and ask for help from whoever I thought best. Usually that was to a local consultant we knew and trusted, but it could be to Newcastle or Norwich, Basingstoke or Barnsley, if that is what we thought was best for our patients. When we thought a patient needed hospital care, we worked out roughly what the problem was and sent that sick person direct to the appropriate specialist team. If it was a gynae problem, for instance, Patients went straight to the gynae ward. There was none of this queuing up in casualty first to see another doctor who might be more junior, know very little about gynecology, and who was under instructions to avoid admissions. Where it was good, pure family medicine was practiced with a full team consisting of GPs, practice nurses, district nurses, health visitors, midwives, bath nurses, social workers, you name it, with good pharmacy support. It was a team approach with one goal, and that was getting the best for our patients and fighting for their cause without fear of recriminations, budget overspends or career threats. When our practice had a vacancy in the mid-1980s, we had over 100 excellent candidates. Admin costs were 4%, and I'll tell you in a minute what they are now. And it was a real privilege to care for and be trusted with the intimate knowledge of, over my whole career, up to 5 or so generations of the same family. That is why it is called family medicine, providing continuity of care. That is a valuable concept ruthless, ignorant politicians driven by ideology are in the process of dismantling. This familiarity encouraged very high levels of trust. And can I give you an example that you might be able to relate to? A man I've known for years presents with a bad headache. We've known each other well enough for a long time to discuss his fears. He worries he has something serious like a brain tumour. I diagnosed and saw his father die of one 20 years before. After a full clinical assessment, the diagnosis is clear to me. It's something else and something I can treat. I explain, tell him he doesn't need a brain scan, treat him, and he leaves happy. A review is planned. He trusts me. We are both satisfied. Now I'm going to go back to that example in a minute, a bit later, to tell you actually what it is like nowadays. How is it now? Well, actually, there's no team anymore. Attached community psychiatric nurses, health visitors, district nurses, social workers are rare or non-existent. Care has been chopped up into individual parts so it can be done by others, cherry-picked and outsourced. Their word for privatised. Care is uncoordinated and communication between overstretched staff is poor. The GP is not anymore the first port of call, and the government encouraged this drift away from general practice. So in fact, you may have this experience. Some patients are unsure where to start. Even I'm confused. Do I ring NHS 111? Do I go to a walk-in centre or A&E? Do I contact one of the commercial online services using the NHS logo, so pretending to be NHS? What about the private Babylon GP at hand service, encouraged very actively by our Secretary of State at the moment? This is all deliberate. When you as patients get to see a GP, you will soon discover the restrictions on what services will be available. In other words, rationing, and Sandra's talked about this. Some of you here, I'm sure, have had hernia repairs or cataract extractions. Don't worry, I'm not going to get you to stand up. They are common operations, and I'm sure a few of you have set off alarms at airports because of your new hips and knees. But I bet what you didn't know is that these have now been classified by the government as of low clinical value. This is a claim Donald Trump would be proud of. It is so ignorant and untrue. These operations are of high clinical value. But soon, as again you've heard from Sandra, you will have a battle on your hands if you need more, if you need one of these procedures. More likely that eventually you won't get it unless you pay. There are restrictions on where and to whom you can be sent. Referrals now can be blocked, delayed, redirected, or rejected outright, often actually by non-qualified people. The team of geniuses brought in to run these reforms, as they call them, and all the other commercialisation has resulted in administration costs now going up to 16%, quadruple. In the USA, it's well over 30%, and we are accelerating in that direction towards a system so wasteful, dangerous, and riddled with fraud, and the commonest reason for bankruptcy in the USA. Most GPs are now salaried. They're salaried employees told how to practice medicine and scared to highlight inadequacies in the system. It's a brave employee who becomes a whistleblower. GPs who now fight on behalf of patients are quickly labelled troublemakers. We know here of doctors who have been suspended, their mental health questioned, and careers cut short as a result of whistleblowing, hung out to dry to cover up the malign effects of government ideology. So let me tell you about the new contract your doctor will be working under from July. It includes incentives to give less care. There's a so-called shared savings scheme, and it's being pushed onto GPs where if they cut care, they will share in the savings made. Just let that sink in. If doctors restrict services to their patients, they will profit. How does that affect trust? Your medical records will be shared widely, compromising confidentiality. You will be forced to see less skilled staff. My local clinical commissioning group boss, a doctor, told me I can no longer be my patient's advocate. I must primarily think of what the country can afford, or rather should be paying for, implying this should be limited. Besides, he said, you can no longer call him or her your patient. That's all changed. Patients now belong to a practice. But practices are being herded together, and then you will belong to an integrated care provider company. That is straight from the American system, which is twice as expensive, with outcomes amongst the worst in the Western world. And what does all this mean? First, continuity care is being destroyed. With that, more mistakes, waste, duplication, expense, and frustration on the part of patients and doctors. It's goodbye to GP autonomy. The plan is to break the link between doctors and patients. GPs will receive instructions as to how to do their job. Family medicine in small, intimate practices will be a thing of the past. There is less and less personal care, so you have to ask yourself, who is responsible for your care? Where does the buck stop? The 8,000 practices in England are to be reduced to 1,500. 50,000 in one group is not going to be unusual. GPs are going to be kettled into large anonymous hubs where you will not see a familiar face, and you have to travel a lot further for the privilege. The aim is that patients associate themselves with buildings instead, and so eventually to the companies that own them. So what about my patient now with a bad headache? It could be you, so let's say it is you. This is how it will be. This is how it's becoming. You will have an 0800 number, and if you pass the security questions, you will first find yourself speaking to a school leaver sitting in front of a computer terminal, following a protocol entitled headaches. This already happens at NHS 111. If you give all the right answers, you may then get through to a receptionist, or to direct you to a healthcare assistant, or perhaps, if you strike it rich, even to a nurse. Having gone all through the questions again, an administrator might get involved to see if you can be diverted somewhere else. If you get over these hurdles, you might then find yourself speaking to a nurse practitioner, or this new grade of medic called a physician's assistant, to go through all the questions again. These are to doctors what classroom assistants are to teachers. By this stage, you are beginning to wonder if your headache is caused by the stress of all this, and you're pretty well tempted to give up. But if you strike really lucky, you might get a Skype interview with a real doctor, or even be invited up for a consultation, but not before probably going through all the security questions again. This will be with a doctor you've never seen before, does not know your background, but don't worry, all is not lost. He has your electronic notes. So now I understand why government ministers have banged on about note sharing all these years. Actually, they've been selling your data to the insurance industry without you knowing. Anyway, back to your headache. When this doctor is quick to tell you that you don't need a brain scan, what thought goes through that aching brain of yours? Is it really unbiased clinical advice you are getting purely in your best interests? Or is there pressure on a doctor to spend less? Is he benefiting from that shared savings scheme I mentioned? Has he got a target to reach? Has he been bullied by that CCG boss who says, put the country first, not your patient? Can he really be trusted? And when your problem doesn't settle, you won't have to go through all this again, and you probably get, if you do get to see a doctor, it'll probably be a different one. The more affluent middle classes will soon get fed up with this and jump ship. Exactly what the head of NHS England, Simon Stevens, wants. So let's go down a little bit. So basically, when I was a lad, patients had access first to the most highly trained professional with the smallest blind spot for error. Now the first port of call will be the least qualified contact with the biggest blind spot, much more likely to make a mistake. So why am I telling you all this? First, because the media aren't telling you it. Secondly, you have to know that the threats to your local hospital are not in isolation. The secret, sinister plot to get rid of our NHS, making a few people extremely rich, is dependent on a root and branch ripping up of all you know and hold dear. Hospital services and general practice. Bevan's publicly funded, publicly provided and delivered, publicly accountable NHS will be no more. One of the fundamental cornerstones of a humane society that defines our country. So finally, what can you do about it? I've tried medical politics, that was no fun. My union, the BMA, is a disgrace. Dave, Bob and I have tried national politics, standing on a Save the NHS ticket, which didn't do a lot of good either, as we didn't get the message delivered to the public sufficiently enough to derail this tragedy. So my very last attempt to get through to people what a precious thing we're about to lose through deceit is a novel. It might, I hope, inform and influence people in an entertaining way and get folk protesting. We could learn a thing or two from Extinction Rebellion and their protests about climate change. So this is my shameless plug, a book called The Deceit Syndrome. That's a flyer, not the book. It's much bigger than that. It was published in March. Oh, thank you, Colin. And all proceeds of this book are going to campaigns like KOSHH, fighting for the NHS. So get angry. This will affect you and your family more than any other issue. Thank you. And if you'd like a book, see me afterwards.
A new hospital is not on offer in this plan. Instead, this plan offers the loss of one or both of our existing acute hospitals. We need more hospitals, not fewer. If, like us, you think we need to retain the 2 general acute hospitals we already have, you might like to sign our petition at koshh.org/petition. Let's keep our local acute hospital services. Your life may literally depend upon it. Thanks for watching, and please share this video to let more people know about it.